December 17th, 1944, near Bastonia, Belgium. Snow whipped across the Ardennes forest, carried by a biting wind that sliced through the gaps in torn Wehrmacht greatcoats. The low growl of distant artillery rumbled over the hills, muffled but constant, like thunder that never ended. Oberfreiter Karl Meisner tightened the frayed scarf around his neck as he crouched beside a broken Opel Blitz truck, half buried in the snow. The vehicle's radiator hissed steam, its engine long dead. The last of his unit's supply convoy had stalled out before dawn, leaving them stranded on the edge of a frozen road. Around him, 4 mechanics from the 26th Volk Grenadier Division worked in grim silence, their tools clinking faintly in the cold. "Another one gone," muttered Feldfehl Dietrich, the oldest of them, wiping grease from his blackened hands. "We'll never get this heat moving again. Bearings are shot. No spares, no oil, nothing." Karl leaned back against the wheel well, staring out toward the tree line. Beyond the mist, he could hear the rhythmic drone of engines, deep, confident, and relentless. Not the sputtering cough of their blitz trucks, but something far stronger. Moments later, the sound emerged over the rise, a long column of olive-drab vehicles rolling in perfect formation along a parallel forest track. Even through the snow, their markings were clear. White stars on canvas, steel and fuel drums. "Americana," Dietrich spat, though there was no hatred in his tone, just resignation. The lead vehicle was like nothing Karl had ever seen up close. It wasn't a tank, nor a half-track. It was a truck, massive, purposeful, and moving with the calm rhythm of a machine that never failed. Its broad fenders were caked with mud, its headlights half covered with blackout shields. And yet it plowed through the snow like it was nothing. "GMC," whispered one of the mechanics, reading the letters stenciled across the hood as the convoy rumbled by. "The Americans call it the Deuce and a Half, 2.5 tons capacity." Karl said nothing. He just watched, truck after truck stretching as far as the eye could see, each loaded with crates, drums, fuel, ammunition, and food. The lifeblood of an army on the move. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all in motion, all perfectly maintained. And that sound, that deep, unbroken chorus of engines, it was the sound of something more powerful than any tank or gun. It was the sound of an army that could move wherever it wished, whenever it wished. Dietrich kicked at the snow, shaking his head. "You see that, Messner? That's why we'll lose this war. They build 100 of those, while we struggle to fix one." Karl didn't answer. He was still staring at the convoy as it disappeared into the mist, the dark shapes fading like ghosts, leaving behind the faint smell of gasoline and hot oil. The broken Blitz beside him groaned as another mechanic slammed its hood shut in frustration. But for Karl, that sound, that stubborn, tired groan, did no longer mean the same thing. Because in that frozen moment, he understood something he'd never dared to say aloud. The war wasn't being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost on the assembly line. And the Americans, they had turned their factories into weapons. Karl rose slowly, brushing frost from his uniform, his eyes lingering on the trail the convoy had left behind. 2 perfect lines carved in the snow, stretching eastward toward the front. "They'll roll all the way to Berlin," he murmured. Dietrich sighed, his breath of pale cloud in the air. "And there's nothing we can do to stop them." 2 days later, the same sound returned, but this time it came closer. A light snow drifted over the outskirts of a ruined Belgian village. As Karl and his team trudged toward the square, the battlefront had shifted overnight, leaving behind a strange silence. Burned-out German half-tracks and abandoned Allied jeeps littered the road. Among the wreckage sat a large olive-green truck, its rear canvas torn by shrapnel, its tires half sunk into the slush. Dietrich froze, his breath catching. "That's one of them, the GMC." Cautiously, the men approached. The cab door hung open, riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the smell of gasoline and scorched rubber mingled with the faint trace of American cigarettes. The driver's seat was empty. The truck had been hastily abandoned, probably during a retreat or artillery barrage. Carl brushed the snow from the hood, tracing his gloved fingers over the stenciled letters, GMC CKW 353. He pulled himself into the cab and turned the key out of habit. The engine coughed once, then roared to life.
Ammunition and warm clothes. Logistics, he realized, wasn't just about movement. It was about certainty. The Americans could afford to lose a truck, a plane, or even a division and replace it all by next week. Germany, by contrast, had long since exhausted that luxury. Their supply trains were bombed, their factories shredded by Allied air raids. Replacement parts took months, if they came at all. Even the mighty Tiger tanks, admired and feared by all, often stood idle for lack of spare treads or fuel. Carl's thoughts were interrupted by a distant hum, faint but growing. Engines again. He stepped outside the barn and shaded his eyes against the snowfall. Across the valley, a new Allied convoy was advancing. Rows of trucks just like theirs, headlights dim under blackout covers, each keeping perfect distance from the next. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. He felt it again, that hollow pressure in his chest. Awe, envy and despair all twisted together. Dietrich joined him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think the Americans didn't understand war. All that luxury, all that excess. But this is war. Not the fighting. The feeding, the fueling, the moving." Carl nodded slowly. "And we can't match it." "No," Dietrich said, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. "We never could. We were building dreams while they were building engines." The two men stood in silence as the sound of the Allied trucks rolled across the valley, a low, unbroken chorus of mechanical precision. It was the sound of inevitability, of a machine that could not be stopped by bravery or strategy or pride. When the last truck disappeared into the snow, Carl turned back to their own captured GMC. It idled steadily, exhaust rising like steam from a locomotive. And in that moment, he knew the war was no longer about who had the best soldiers or the fiercest weapons. It was about who could move, who could sustain, and the Americans could move forever. January 2nd, 1945. Somewhere near Prüm, Germany. The snow had deepened overnight, muffling the rumble of distant artillery and burying the last remnants of the Ardennes offensive beneath a heavy white shroud. Carl Messner sat inside the cab of the captured GMC truck, his breath fogging the windshield. The vehicle had become both refuge and revelation, a small pocket of warmth in a collapsing war. Outside, the rest of the mechanics worked silently, salvaging what they could from the remains of their retreat. Broken half-tracks, burned motorcycles, twisted axles. Each one a small monument to Germany's crumbling logistics. The truck beside them, the American truck, still stood tall.